This week's Parsha describes the gifts that were brought by the Nasim, the 12 leaders of the Jewish tribes, on the day of the consecration of the Mishkan. And these gifts included wagons and cattle for the transportation of the Mishkan when it traveled, as well as animals and flour and incense that was all brought as a special offering to Hashem. And many of the commentators wonder as to why the Nasim chose to bring these gifts specifically on the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan. And among the many interpretations are two fascinating approaches that I want to share with you. The first is that perhaps we might suggest that there was some type of potential halachic dilemma faced by the Nasim regarding the cattle that they donated for transporting the Mishkan. You see, the Gemara Menachos establishes that a person may not donate to the temple treasury. A person may not donate to the Bedek Habayit animals that are in fact suitable for sacrificial offering. You see, if an animal meets the strict qualifications for suitability, if it's fit to be a sacrifice, rather than as a financial donation to the treasury, it must be consecrated as a sacrifice instead of that donation. And so the Nasim who wished to donate cattle to the Mishkan for the purpose of transportation, they faced a major problem. You see, on the one hand, if they donated unblemished cattle, they'd be in violation of this halacha, which forbids consecrating suitable animals for purposes other than sacrifices. On the other hand, donating blemished animals might be construed as a sign of disrespect to Hashem and the Mishkan. And so for this reason, the Nasim were very wise. They presented their gifts immediately on the day of the Mishkan's inauguration, before the Mizbeach, before the altar was formally consecrated for use. And because the Mizbeach had yet to be consecrated, the animals in any event could not as yet be offered as sacrifices. And so the Nasim, these tribal leaders, were therefore allowed to designate them for purposes other than sacrifices, despite the fact that their physical properties met halacha's credentials for animal sacrifices. But allow me to share with you a second interpretation as to why the Nasim might have chosen to bring these gifts immediately on the day of the Mishkan's inauguration. You see, Rashi very famously quotes the Midrash that on the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, the Jewish people were like a bride walking to the chuppah. And the Mishkan, the site where Hashem and Bnei Israel encountered one another, so to speak, would be comparable to a chuppah, where a bride and groom, they enter into the covenant of marriage. And this, however, marked only the first stage of the wedding process. As we know from our tradition, the halachic process of marriage requires that the couple both stand under the chuppah, as well enter into a yichud room following the ceremony, as they enter into a private room together as husband and wife. And similarly, the marriage relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people, it also began with the chuppah. It also began with the Mishkan. But it was not concluded until the Jewish people's entry into the land of Israel. That final stage, which corresponds to the yichud, the seclusion of a bride and a groom, it finalized the process of the Jewish people's marriage to the Almighty. And so we can perhaps suggest that the gift that the Nasim brought, they were intended to bridge between these two stages of the wedding process. Immediately upon the Mishkan's inauguration, the Nasim brought wagons with which the Mishkan would be transported to Eretz Yisrael. And you have to remember that until the sin of the spies, the Jewish people were said to have entered into the land of Israel just a few days after leaving Sinai. This would establish the necessary link between this first stage of the marriage and the inauguration of the Mishkan and the final stage, which is the Jewish people's arrival into the land of Israel. And perhaps we can even add to this by suggesting that the occasion of the Mishkan's inauguration was obviously a moment of incredible joy and celebration and happiness for the entire Jewish people, the culmination of a process that began all the way back, leaving Egypt as part of the Exodus. And the Nasim, the nation's leaders, they found it necessary to remind the people that this was not the final stage in the relationship with Hashem. The wilderness of Sinai, it was not going to be their last stop. And so right on this day, during the festivities that surrounded the Mishkan's inauguration, the Nasim brought wagons as a reminder, that the Mishkan will not remain in the wilderness. It will not remain in Sinai forever. And yet the Jewish people, the nation, had yet to reach their final destination. As significant of a moment as this was, it was never intended as the Jewish people's permanent condition. The wagons, in a sense, serve to symbolize the temporary nature of their current state. The fact that the momentous occasion of the Mishkan's inauguration was just the first stage of the process, which would reach its culmination only and only when the Jewish people would enter into the homeland, enter into the land of Israel. And so as we have now also just concluded our own high, we've just concluded Shavuos, we've come off the incredible high of receiving the Torah. We were inspired through amazing classes and programs. Let us also recognize that this is not the end, but rather the beginning of a process of increasing our Torah learning and continuing on the journey to get closer to Hashem. Shabbat Shalom.